In this week's video, I'll be throwing and trimming some medium-sized angular lidded jar forms. They're simple shapes, and the body section of these jars, which I'm weighing out here from 2 pounds of clay, or about 900 grams, is essentially thrown as one simple cylinder that's then shaped and the opening measured so that I can get the lids to fit exactly right, although the first step in this process, as always, is wedging the clay. This brings together all the individually weighed out pieces, as sometimes I underweigh the initial lump of clay which I tear off from the bigger block and place on the scales. So additions are added, and once it's the correct weight, I'll spiral wedge each piece like this until it feels completely even and smooth. You may also hear pops coming from the lump of clay itself, as small pockets of air are forced against the wooden table, which is a good thing, as ideally the clay I use to throw on the wheel should always be completely void of air, as all it takes is one small air pocket to potentially ruin the pot you're throwing, either by creating a thinness in one section of the wall, which ultimately leads the pot to buckling and collapsing, or it'll cause a slight undulation to appear on the rim of the pot you're throwing, which as you work becomes ever more exacerbated. You can of course also pop any air pockets you come across as you're throwing, just with a potter's needle. As for cleaning my workbench like so, lately I've been using this simple scraper, which has proved to be very handy. I then simply dump all of these scraps into my clay reclaim bucket. Before I begin throwing, let's talk about some of the tools I use. Generally speaking, I'll use the metal kidney for most of my pots. I prefer how its sharper edge scrapes away the slip on the outside surface of the pots. I feel that I can throw surfaces that are much drier and much sharper and cleaner than what I can do with the rubber one, but you will see me using both throughout the throwing process. Then there's the twisted wire, which I slide underneath the pots to separate them from the throwing bats. Then there's the tool that I use for scraping away the skirt of clay around the base of the pots. And lots of you ask me about this one, and in reality, it's just an old turning tool. It's nothing special. Then there's my needle for popping air pockets, and my very basic sponge on a stick, which is just used to mop up excess water from inside the pots. As these pieces have quite delicate galleries, which I don't want to distort by lifting them off of the wheelhead with my hands, I'll use what's called a wooden bat to throw on. This means I can lift the pot away afterwards, simply by lifting up the wooden bat, so I don't have to touch the pot whatsoever. And I should mention, there are numerous ways of doing this. In this instance, I'm throwing a pad of clay, which I dry out, which I can then stick the wooden bats onto. But equally, you can use throwing bats which have 2 holes in, which slot onto 2 metal pins on the wheelhead. Or you can use a more specialised system where you slot either bisque tiles or square pieces of MDF into a hollow of a purposefully made jig that fits on top of the wheelhead itself. And really I think it just comes down to personal preference. I've seen professional potters use each of those methods, and I think you generally just tend to use the technique that you were taught. So this was shown to me in college, and then it was used by Lisa Hammond again during my apprenticeship with her. And I suppose it's simply quite versatile, as once the pad of clay is attached, I can use numerous sizes of bats, and I can easily remove it or add it back if I need it. Anyhow, once I've thrown it, I take my heat gun, which is just a old paint stripper, and I blast the freshly thrown clay until it's more or less leather hard. And then, as the rapid drying can cause it to undulate and distort very slightly, I just use a sharp metal edge to make it nice and flat once again. Then to attach the bats themselves, I simply wipe some water onto the underside and also sprinkle a little bit onto the bat itself. I then spend a second or two tap centering it into place, and once it's in the middle, I hold it on either side and I gently rub it back and forth. And the friction in combination with the water creates slip that dries very quickly, which holds it very firmly in place. This is roughly the same form I'll be making. This is one I threw and fired a couple of months ago, and while I am happy with it, I think the proportions could be altered a little bit. And with these new ones, I want to bring the sharp waist a little bit higher on the form. Using my hand like a scoop, I splash a considerable amount of water onto the lump of clay when I begin centering. Any kind of friction can cause issues as you're throwing, and ideally, I want the lump of clay beneath my hands to glide very smoothly and evenly. So making sure you use enough water is really crucial, but at the same time you don't want to use too much either, as the water will degrade the clay itself. During the centering process, I push the clay up into a cone and then firmly push it back down. The aim here is to get it as central on the wheel head as possible. Once that's been done, I use my thumb and my index finger and I push them down together and then gently pull the base out, whilst also maintaining control with my left hand on the outside of the form. And if I do feel as if the base is still a little bit too thick, I'll push down in the middle and I'll pull out a little bit more clay. And for these pots, I want the base to be about 4 or 5 centimeters thick. I then take a small wetted sponge and use that instead of my knuckle on the outside to gently pull the clay into this tapering cone sort of shape. Using a sponge to throw like this is something I find myself doing sometimes, and other times I won't use one. But generally I think it's when pots start to get a little bit bigger that I begin to use a wet sponge instead of my fingers. The sponge keeps my fingers wet throughout the entire pull, which means there's less of a chance that the clay might catch and stick to my fingers as it dries out. When I do use a sponge though, I make sure that it's a very thin one. I like to be able to feel the clay through it so that I can really tell what's going on with each pull. And as I pull the clay up, I really try to be as even and consistent with my movements as I possibly can. If you suddenly change the rate at which you move your hands, you can end up creating a section of the pot that's either thicker or thinner than what you want. And what's worse than changing speed is hesitating and staying in one spot for far too long, as this creates a very thin band in comparison to the clay all around it, which will often buckle and cause your pot to collapse, which isn't necessarily a bad thing if all you want to do is practice. Throwing cylinders over and over again to their absolute extremities until they collapse and break teaches you a lot about the limits the material can be pushed to. But once I'm happy with a rough cylinder, I'll then begin to portion off the different sections of the vessel. So there's the tapering bottom, the waist, and then the upper section, which will eventually lead to the gallery where the lid is placed. What I always try to do before really defining any shape is I throw a rough form, and once I'm happy with the proportion and the general shape, then I'll begin to go in and add the details. The first I do is I set the rim, and I do this by pushing into the top with a wetted index finger, just to create a slight indent within the diameter of this opening is where the lid will fit. So once I've thrown it, I'll check it with a pair of measured calipers, and if it is correct, I can move on to the finishing procedures for the rest of the piece. I soak up all of the water left inside the pot, as if there is water left inside the vessel overnight, it will quite literally degrade the clay and make a hole in the bottom of your pot. I then remove the excess clay around the base with my blunted old trimming tool, and then I can move on to my favourite part, which is scraping clean the outside surface, removing the slip, smoothing over the throwing lines, and really defining the shape. It's more a case of pushing the clay out to meet the metal, rather than pushing the metal into the pot. And ultimately, I'm not trying to get rid of everything. As long as most of the slip has been removed, I don't mind if there are a few wetter streaks here and there. And while the metal tool is very good for scraping clean the outside surface like this, it does like to stick much more than a rubber kidney might. So when it does come to finishing more delicate parts of a pot, like so, I'll often switch to a rubber tool. Once I'm happy with the form and the opening is at the correct measurement, I'll scrape away all the slip and clay off of the bat, as really you don't want to keep these too wet for too long, as that's when they warp. I then chamois leather the rim smooth, and then slide a twisted wire underneath the piece, and then I use my blunted trimming tool again just to pry off the bat. And then it can be set aside to slowly dry out to leather hard. Once I've thrown all the body sections, I'll then inverse my calipers and also add a millimetre or so to that. This way when I throw my lids, the locating flange will be just slightly bigger than needs be, and I much prefer having lids that I can trim to fit perfectly, in which case there's more material to work with, as opposed to having too little material to work with. The one thing I don't want is a lid that rattles when placed on top of the pot, as the locating flange was thrown to an incorrect measurement. Next, I quickly weigh out the lids. Each of these is about 13 ounces, or 370 grams. The lids in comparison to the bodies are very quick and easy to make. They're quite solid forms, and really the most important thing is making sure that I throw them with a locating flange which is the correct diameter. Otherwise I tend to finish them quite roughly, as eventually every single surface of the lid will be trimmed. So back on the wheel, I wet the underside of a bat, tap center it into the middle, then gently rub it firmly into place. The lids are also quick to make because I'm never pulling the clay up, I'm simply squashing it down, which is a far easier motion to do. I start, as always, by centering the clay, and then I gradually flatten it, like you would when throwing a plate, for instance, and with my left hand guiding it on the outside, I use the flat of my palm to slowly push it down further and further until visually it's wider than the opening of the jar form. I then use my index finger and thumb to pull a very shallow hollow in the middle. I then take the thick rim and I separate it into two distinct parts. There's the section that travels upward, which is the locating flange, which ultimately ends up being the piece that sits inside the jar, and then there's the lower section of the lid, the horizontal section, and the corner these two parts make is the crucial part. So I check to make sure that my calipers fit, and if they do, I'll begin to clean up the form. I use a sponge just to remove as much excess slip as possible, and then I clean up the locating flange and the lower section, just with the sharp edge of a rubber kidney. Removing the slip does definitely help the pieces dry out faster, especially these lids, which have sections that are very thick. If they were instead left covered in slip, it means they dry far slower than the body sections of these jars. And really, I want both components to dry evenly, so when it does come to trimming them and making sure they fit, they're more or less the exact same consistency. If for instance your lid is much wetter than your jar when you trim it, it means the lid still needs to dry out considerably more than the jar until it reaches bone dry, and this could ultimately lead to the lid not fitting right. So it is quite crucial when finishing these pieces the next day when they are leather hard, that you make sure that they're more or less identical in consistency. And as the months get hotter, this can be more and more of a challenge, and monitoring the dryness of the pots can become quite a big task, and in this case, I felt if I let them stay out overnight uncovered, by morning they'd be far too firm. So to sort of halt the drying process, I just wrap the pots up with some sheet plastic, and I'll even spray them with some water too, if they are getting too firm. This whole process though, is really dependent on what your studio's like, and the country you live in, and even the type of clay that you use too. It all makes a difference. The following morning, these were more or less the perfect condition to trim. You want to be able to handle the pots without them deforming, and they should, if squeezed gently, retain their shape. Trimming work that's either too firm or too soft only makes the process of trimming more difficult. So making sure you catch it at just the right moment really does make all the difference. As you may have just seen, the lid was a little bit too big for the jar itself, which like I mentioned previously is a good thing, as it means I'll be able to trim this locating flange section till it's just the right size for the jar itself. So I begin by placing the lid down, trimming it, and then I can just check by offering up the jar to the lid. And once it fits perfectly, like so, and once it fits well, I'll just trim the rest of the lid, neatening up the form as well as doing the inside, which can be tricky as all the trimmings just collect in on themselves, but it helps to remove some of the weight in the lid. In some cases too, I can almost trim and undercut into the thicker section of the lid, hollowing it out slightly. But then, once I'm content with the lid, I'll apply some slip either to the wheel head or sometimes even the pot itself, and then I rub the piece back and forth on the wheel until it's more or less perfectly centered. And in this case, you can see that there's a slight undulation in the rim, but that'll be easy to deal with. Once centered, I'll take a rubber kidney and I'll just squash this tiny portion of clay into the wheel head, doubling down on how secure the piece is to the wheel. To fix the undulation, I very carefully trim the rim, holding my tool in such a way that it only trims the highest point that spins around. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it will make trimming the lid easier later on. Next, I can begin to trim the body of the jar itself, again a task made infinitely more enjoyable by my bison trimming tools. I like trimming forms that I can get my hand inside, as I can feel the area opposite of where my tool is trimming on the inside. That's why you'll see my hand darting around as I work. As I trim these, I'm thinning out the walls to make the overall weight of the vessel lighter, and I'm also further refining the original throne shape. I want that line around the waist to be as crisp and sharp as possible, to echo the same sort of line that'll appear on the top of the lid. Like I've mentioned previously, trimming is definitely my favourite part of the process. I really enjoy taking the rough throne form and trimming it to be as thin as I can possibly make it, within reason. And I suppose ultimately there's a satisfaction that comes with making objects that are delicate and thin and comfortable from essentially a material that is mud and dirt and stone and rock. And through the process of throwing it, trimming it, and firing it, it's changed into something that's completely different. And now you can really begin to see the form coming out. Practically, when throwing, you can only make the base so narrow, whilst maintaining a certain level of structural integrity. So I tend to leave the bases of these at the thrown stage quite thick, and then I just trim them to be much thinner. The one thing my new bison trimming tools do is they tend to leave a slight chattering on the surface of the clay. So to remove this, I just take a sharp metal edge, like this palette knife here, and I just hold it against the surface to remove the worst of them. Once the body has been trimmed, I place the lid on top with a tiny bit of slip just to hold it securely in place, and then I can begin to trim it, removing the excess clay until this outward angle of the lid comes to meet the tapering inward section of the top of the jar. And I do remove a lot of clay during this process. In theory, yes, I could throw the lids more accurately to begin with, but equally, as I do trim these so much, both the lid and the jar, I prefer to have excess material to work with as opposed to not enough, which by now you can see is a trend in my making. As I suppose with leather hard pots, it's very easy to subtract clay, but adding it back is another matter altogether. I then took a moment just to neaten up the indent around the rim, as I want this to be a right angle if possible, so that the glaze reacts really dramatically on that edge. I then place the lid back on, and I begin to trim the very top. And here, what I'm aiming to do is to make a concave surface. That way, when I dip them in my glaze, it'll pool really thickly in this hollow, and when it fires, the glaze will flatten out into a perfectly flat surface. And while you might never know that there is a concave surface beneath it, the reason the glaze looks like it does is because of this hollowed out surface. And I'll quickly just include a photo of what that looks like once fired. The lid can then be removed, and then the pot itself I carefully slice off of the wheelhead using the sharp edge of this metal knife. I quickly make sure that the wheelhead is smooth and free of any burrs of clay that might stick back into the lid, and then I position this upside down like it was at the beginning, and then place the jar over it. And to secure it in place, I simply press 3 lumps of soft clay around the outside of the lid. One of my spinners goes on top, which allows me to press downward quite firmly without distorting the base, and then I'll trim this lower section once again. The use of the spinner really helps during this process, as without it, there's a good chance that as I trim, the jar itself, as it isn't really secured by anything, might leap up out of the chuck, which is essentially the lid. So as I trim, I'm constantly applying quite significant downward pressure. And once again I'm using a flat-edged metal tool just to smooth over some of those more significant chattering marks. I then switch to a much smaller looped trimming tool to turn a beveled edge onto the bottom of the pot. And then for the actual base itself, I simply go over it very carefully. I'm not removing a lot, but what I do remove is the wiring off marks that are left when you slice the pot off at the thrown stage. Once trimmed, I take the flat edge of a kidney, and I burnish the bottom to be even smoother. This also pushes in any exposed, sharp pieces of grog that might be left in the body. And finally, I stamp the pot with my maker's mark, which is just my signature. It's the way people identify the pots that I've made. I can then set the body of the jar aside very carefully so that the base itself isn't damaged, as the trimmed clay is still very soft. And then I spend a few last moments just cleaning up the underside of the lid, removing tiny amounts of clay just to ensure that the surfaces are nice and flat and as clean as possible, as much of the clay on this part of the vessel will remain unglazed. I then spend a few seconds just doing some last minute quality control on the top surface, which usually just consists of a quick burnish and also running my fingers over the sharp edge on the outside. And that's the piece finished. A simple angular jar. As always, thanks for watching, and you may or may not see me next week, as I'm moving flat, and I might not have internet in the new place straight away, so until next time.